Close enough, the neighbor.
Okay, thank you guys all for coming out. I think we are at quorum now, so I think we can go ahead and start the meeting. I call this meeting to order at 2:03 p.m. This item on the agenda, territorial acknowledgement. The Board of Directors acknowledges that the University of Waterloo is on the traditional territory of the neutral, Anishinaabe, and Haudenosaunee peoples. Our organization operates on the Haldimand Tract, land promised to the Six Nations, which includes 6 miles on each side of the Grand River. Next, moving on to the agenda approval. So be it resolved that the board approve the meeting agenda as presented, and I have a seconder for that item. Are there any other comments, concerns with regards to this? Not seeing any. We'll go ahead to a vote. All those in favor, please raise your hand. Not seeing anyone online raising their hand. I see Jack now. Okay. All those opposed, please raise your hand. Okay. Not seeing any. So then we will move on to our next item. Would anyone like to declare a conflict of interest at this time? Seeing any. Then we'll move on to next item on the agenda, which is item 6.1. So discussion on the vice president role, duties, responsibilities, and support. This is brought forward by Katie. I will go ahead and second it, and then we will pass it to Katie to begin the discussion.
Okay. First, I would just kind of like to say that the main point of the discussion item that I brought forward is really just to, in my perspective, share information, get other thoughts and comments, and also really look at the longevity of the supports for the officer positions. So one of the main goals that I really want through this discussion is really looking at the incoming work that the vice president's role will have to take on, look at our organization structure and really identify long-term what we define as advocacy. For instance, a lot of the context behind the discussion that I've put forward is based on the idea that we will eventually come to want to do larger advocacy projects in the future. We might be taking on more advocacy work, or we look at advocacy defined as lobbying, doing more campaigns, doing more research, and so forth. So that is essentially the preface for how I would like to start the discussion on what I wanted to bring forward. But the main issue that I've identified in my role, or at least the main point that I wanted to bring up today, is that I believe is possibly in the best interest for the next board to also really recognize the amount of work and time it takes for both officers to complete a lot of the different aspects of their role. During the time of my role, I felt as though I was very supported by staff and everything that I wanted to do. But I think there were some gaps for me personally, where I think as a board and as an organization, we could have essentially looked more into or looked to develop in the future. So this is more of also information for the next board to recognize and see what they want to do in the future. But essentially from the discussion, I wanted to bring up how in the past in 2021, there were previous other VP associate positions who helped the VP do different types of work, and that included municipal affairs, provincial and federal affairs. Over the course of the past year, I've discussed some of the challenges that I've had with Youth Crew, our federal organization, and then also a lot of the different projects I took up on the municipal level as well as the provincial level. From all of that, I think from my perspective, some of the current gaps that we have in which we can look towards the future as a board and as for the incoming board to look into includes how we define advocacy and what our main goals as a student association are. And one of the ways that we can also do that is looking at other student unions. I think there's potential for us to really do a lot of work for lobbying and advocacy related events. for instance, at Western, they have something called Women in Leadership, where they invite different MPPs, MPs, and other female or women leaders to come to their institution and essentially celebrate their success. And I think having that on our campus would also be very inclusive of a campus community. With that in mind, there are certain aspects of this year that, at least in my role, I wasn't able to be a part of because of the sheer amount of work that I was doing, but also the complexity that it required to do that work. And that included budget submission processes. And I think also essentially understanding that a lot of the work that officers do needs to begin at the start of the year and end at the year would require some support or staff that could essentially alleviate a lot of the burdens that can be put on individual officers, and also look at where there are gaps and essentially go in that direction to see if there's potential for us to expand. And I think budget submissions was one of them. I know I talk a little bit about the potential of another executive position, but I guess you could say my main goal is to see the improvement of our governance structure and to see us as a student association reach the same level of relationships in advocacy as other student unions such as Brock, such as McMaster, and such as Western or UBC. And that is one of the main things I wanted to bring forward today as a discussion if anyone had any thoughts. But essentially, that's all I really wanted to say, and I hope that is reflected in what I put in the discussion item.
Okay. I'll open it up to the floor then. Or go ahead, Pam.
Why do you think this should be an additional executive role and not something that can be given to the directors?
I've already, in passing, brought this up to a few people, but I think from my perspective, there are two main reasons. One is that from the beginning of at least our year to the end of our year, there has been an emphasis on essentially maintaining the fiduciary duty of directors. And I think the complexity of what the officers do on a day-to-day basis can't necessarily be picked up by directors. For instance, the same thing, I've had this discussion as well, where it's like, one of the reasons why I don't believe it can't be a regular part-time staff who does this work is because in order to do a lot of this planning, in order to do a lot of this like long-term thinking, you need to have someone from the beginning of your term to the end of your term. And I think one of our goals as a student association should be to empower student leaders to really take the initiative to create another, let's say, maybe transitionary role who could inevitably step up to be president as well, to understand the org and also do that type of work. And one of the reasons why I bring up fiduciary duties is because we've also in our year been told that we're meant to separate the work that directors are doing from the work that staff are doing. And in my perspective, this is the work of staff. So that's one of the reasons. The second reason is mainly because I guess you could say I would like to see our executive team be strengthened and essentially be uplifted. And I think the roles of the officers are something that only really the officers understand. And as seen in other executive teams at other institutions, there are numerous executives who all support the president and vice president, but unlike other institutions, ours only has two roles. And that's not really reflected in other student unions and associations because they also recognize that in order to have a very supportive team of staff members, as well as understand the unique complexities of being officers, it's often best to have like a small team of officers who can balance that workload. And I know I didn't really clarify that well, but I guess you could say I hope that's the perspective I'm taking.
Go ahead, Alex.
I think we're all thinking it. That does sound like previous governance models where we had a team of executives, sort of.
Sort of.
I had a question. In the issue section, you mentioned specifically recruiting another executive officer who would serve as a part-time staff member. Could you, maybe I'm probably tripping it up in my head how that would work. This would be another executive, like a student executive,
Yeah.
but a staff member?
Yeah, so that practice is really common among other student associations and unions. Essentially, they would not necessarily have a voting power on our board, but would be a staff that's specifically there at the beginning of the officer's term to the end of the term to support them and their work. For instance, Rory and I are often double or triple booked, and there's a lot of stuff that we can't do or we are incapable of doing, or we're often left at certain situations where we're facing a lot of burnout and a lot of extra work by ourselves. And that's why I think the main point of the discussion is not, I know I really pointed towards having like a part-time staff or someone who is titled as an executive to like be as close to the officers as can be and be coordinating with the officers about what the board's vision is and like long-term and longevity of our advocacy work. But I really would just like to say, I think that we need support as officers.
Okay.
That's like where it's really coming from.
Just picking off where you ended, I agree. Just seeing the workload of YouTube, it also doesn't make sense, I guess, for VP to be managing provincial, federal, and municipal, like being the point person for all three of those, splitting focus. But I guess it just comes down to like how we go about that. One question I wanted to ask for, how have you interacted with the new advocacy student support specialist? I'm not sure, butchering the title, but I think we hired a bunch of students to support the advocacy department. That how have you been supported by these specialists, or like, because I'm thinking they almost seem like they would fit the criteria that you're looking for, where ideally we'd have them for the entire year, and like you could rely on them to directly support the officers and different advocacy initiatives.
I have been really supported by that group of students as well as that team, especially when it comes to the development of our stances and the goals that we've set out on our annual plan. But I would say the main differentiation for the criteria is that what I've experienced this year, and I think it's just because of the sheer amount of work that we've had to do throughout the year with updating our stances, as well as multiple different events on campus and just multiple different things that have come up, that I would often ask for support. I would still get support, but it's the same as like picking up someone and saying like, this is the work I would like you to be doing. So maybe it's also just about having that part-time staff alongside the officers all throughout the year. So I don't necessarily mean like those part-time staff can't do it, but maybe in the structure that we currently have it requires like having that part-time staff essentially have different roles and responsibilities compared to other part-time staff. And in my mind, what that would mean is that they are not really an advocacy team part-time staff anymore. They have their own role, which is, in my mind, more similar to what the officers are doing, if that kind of makes sense.
Sort of. Maybe this is just would it not be possible to, I guess, what is the difference between the student being part of the advocacy team and are you saying like they would report somewhat directly to you, or at least be directly assigned to an issue that at the start of the year you agree? I'm trying to see if there's any way we can adapt the model to give the officers more supports, or if indeed we need a new officer.
I would say it depends on the goals of the next board. For instance, a lot of the reason why I think this, trying to think of how I should answer this. I think there are many ways to realign what we want to do in the next year by seeing what we can do with the advocacy team. My only concern with that is that the advocacy team also has a lot of other work that they do throughout the year. And it's also kind of asking them to put on more work for individual students from that team. And I don't know, or I don't necessarily know if not singling out, but asking one individual student from that team who signed up for a different type of work to be assigned in that way, not unless we plan it now and it's prepared for next year. So I hope that answers the question. I'm not sure if I did.
Anyone else wants to jump on?
Dan, go ahead next.
Jeff asked my question, but I guess kind of related. So how would this fit into the structure? Would they be part of like the government staff? Would they like report to us the same way Suzanne reports to us? Or name the advocacy department?
Did I need to jump in on this one? I don't think you want to make it too complicated. Just coming into this from the outside and only reading this, what I'm hearing is the officers needs more support. So what's the best way to give the officers more support? Katie's talking about the primary area she was focusing on was advocacy this year. So one option is to look at what the advocacy team has, and is that the right direction to go? I don't think you don't want to add more officers, because to Alex's point, that's taking you back into where you were before, but yet you've got two positions that needs more help. So I think you can probably take it that, let's say, if everyone can be in agreement that more help is needed, then take it offside and ask Suzanne and the team to come up with an option. I think the other thing I was hearing was there's lots of support for making sure that there are student leadership opportunities that come out of this, whatever that's going to be, whether it's a part-time position or full-time. And Katie's other point, which I think is absolutely right, you've got to have that person assigned to the officers right from the get-go, so they're there with you for the whole year. Is that? I think that's what I heard you saying.
Yeah, I guess if I were to add anything onto that, it's kind of like if we were to look at the advocacy team and look at essentially finding that person to be there from the beginning to the end of the year. In my mind, I think it's really good if we also recognize their contribution as more than just being a student from the advocacy team. And I guess that's why you can, at least that's why from my perspective, it makes more sense for them to be seen as an executive, not necessarily an officer, one that like has the voting power, but someone, a student leader who knows what they're doing, knows that they have the capacity to work within the organization on multiple levels and be of support to us. And I know that sounds very complex, but I think I know we shouldn't really be delving into it, but that's like where I'm coming from. And I'm not saying our board has to do anything about it. It's more for next board to see like what is the best path. And of course, like, I'm not sure if the president, not like next president and like next VP are here. So like, that's something that they would have to discuss with each other about, because at the end of the day, the actual discussion is just more about what is the next board's goals for advocacy. If we have less goals for, let's say, lobbying, research, campaigning outside of what we already do, maybe we don't need this type of position. But I think if we want to expand our influence and expand the voices of our students, it is something to be considered. So that is what I would like to know.
Melissa, you had your hand up for a second there. I'm not sure if you're wanting to jump in on some of the previous things that have been brought up, or.
Yeah, I think Sandra covered some, and I think ultimately there are different places within the advocacy team that obviously we could look to support what Katie is talking about and more support for the officers specifically in the advocacy way. I think to your point, Jeff, the advocacy part-time staff right now have some very specific thematic areas that they support, either their mental health, international students, they align with our advocacy priorities specifically. But if we're looking for support more on the lobbying side or more in provincial, federal, municipal, like we could adapt some job descriptions that fit more to what the type of support Katie's looking for. So I think we could look at options within the team for sure. I think the biggest thing for me is wanting to make sure that the officers could get the support they need, but also that what's happening there stays connected with the other work of the department, which I know has been the challenge in the past, is if there's somebody reporting into the officers that then isn't connected to the rest of the work, making sure that all of those pieces are communicating with each other, they all have the same information, they're all, headed in the same direction, and that then the officers don't end up with more work on the management side of things versus time to actually do the work that they want to do. I think sort of to Katie's point about depending on what the goals of the next board is, the other thing to really consider, and I think this is more too around what the VP role is focusing on is if the VP is going to take on a large role in either UCRU, WUSA, or CASA, whatever that looks like, that takes a significant portion of time, which Katie had a lot of responsibilities for, that then spends more time on outward lobbying efforts through those organizations as opposed to some of the internal advocacy pieces that we do. So I can also see that if that is a goal of the board for that role to be more involved there, then we might need to fill some of those other gaps through part-time student staff and other ways. So I think that changes it too, because I'm sure Katie could speak to the amount of time that those commitments took. And then she was also trying to do those other pieces. So I think the more that that gets discussed too as a group is, you know, is this a year, depending on what's on the agenda, where you want the VP to, you know, be the vice president at WUSA? How much time does that really take? I mean, Katie's the one who's going to know what that looks like. It's a lot more commitment and time than that takes away from other things. So then where do we need to fill those gaps? I think it'll change each year depending on where the VP focuses their time. So all that is to say, as the structure builds up, we're figuring out where that support is needed. I think there's lots of room for that. We've got an additional advocacy specialist this year. I think there's opportunity for the stakeholder relations, again, to sort of expand what their part-time support is, if that's where students want to be more involved. I think there's lots of opportunity there, just mapping out where that support is needed, what kind of support, and then is it the same role with a different area, or are there actually some different student roles there that we haven't sort of looked at yet? So
Alex, you had your hand up.
So super fast. So then is this relatively accurate? Took effect from September 2023.
Is that relatively accurate?
Yeah, is that accurate or have we switched?
It really depends, I think, on
I've set the situation so that we can help with.
I know there was.
It's not like that. This is being recorded though.
Can I help it, right?
Yes, this is helpful.
When in doubt, I tried to.
Yeah, here is, you needed help on something.
It's an opportunity.
Okay. Pause this conversation.
Okay.
yeah, sorry.
Sorry, going back to Alex. Sorry. Did you get
I'm
the
sure we
information that you're
can
looking
talk
for?
about it after.
I'll come back to it. You guys keep going.
May I jump in really
Yes,
quickly?
go ahead.
It's really exactly as Melissa says this fall. It's kind of like, if we want to encourage the next VP to take on larger positions in other organizations, more support will be needed. If that's not necessarily the VP's priority and the board's priority, what I'm bringing up here might not even be needed, that kind of thing.
One thing you brought up earlier when I was coming in, apologies, was around why you believe board members wouldn't be able to help fill in this gap because of I think, their fiduciary duty and separation between board and staff work. Which are really valid points. The first one I was a little bit confused by because officers are also bound by the same, they are directors. So if we could elaborate a bit on that part, that would be a misunderstanding. I guess on the other end, directors that come in sometimes can, like, would directors not be able to perhaps take on stuff like assist with the helping drive the advocacy direction of certain areas as well, or is maybe I'll example, would that be trying to like, do you understand what I'm sort of getting at, where directors could also support officers?
Do you want me to try? I think I'm understanding a little bit of where you're heading. You've created, and I'm going to bring you back to your current structure. You've got the officers, you've got the board, and you've got committees. And one of the committees you have is the your advocacy position committee, which is the one that's driving really the things that you want to do. Working with the advocacy department, so that all comes together. So directors are part of that committee. So to quickly answer your question, that is one way that the directors can do it. The other piece that was starting to come in my mind, and it's back to Tam's point about what other things might directors be able to do. If part of the role of the VP, let's say it's as big as what you had right now, you also wanted to do municipal, provincial, and federal relationship building. Well, you may decide that that's not, that, okay, this is where you do need additional support. That can be work of the board. So Tim could be, for argument's sake, could be your MPP relationship builder. And she's the one that would take all the meetings, still keeping it within the role that you're doing. I'm still hearing you say, though, regardless of what you happen to do this year, what should be considered is what kind of support do the officers need to be able to carry out the roles that they are. And they're not board positions, it's just general support. What kind of support do you need?
May I speak?
Yeah, go ahead.
Thank you for tying us back into the main point of, yeah, what sort of support. When I try to place myself in an officer's shoes, which is hard for me, never being an officer, when I think like who would my coming into something that's so advocacy focused and have all these advocacy gaps, to me, I feel like my biggest support, my biggest wealth of knowledge would be our director of outreach and communications. Like, since you're there, years previous and years future, that's what it sort of feels like to me. So I honestly wonder if this is more so a question of staff moving up the chain to support the officer roles more in some sort of capacity. But I think this is a really valuable conversation to be having on how we fix that. Because to me, it screams staff to some sense.
If I were to add like one last thing on, it's kind of like, yes, I have like, this is all coming from my perspective, and like, yes, I have specific projects that I would have loved to done, like to have completed this year. But I think the support that I needed as a officer is someone who can at any point, let's say I'm away, understand what I'm doing municipally, federally, and provincially, and like come in to help me. Like I could think of specific instances where it's like I would have liked more support here, I would have liked more support here, but that's all like minute stuff that like long term won't really help us see it, like what this support could look like. So at the end of the day, still like next board's discussion on like what the goals are at transition. Yeah.
Okay. Other?
So I guess to like, why could that, so we have the vertical support from staff or whatever an officer, like supporting officer position might look like. Like, well, we need more of that vertical support, I think. That's fair. Like, bear with me with this metaphor, but also horizontally, like different directors helping with different advocacy areas. So it's not just everything, like you don't have to oversee like every single minute detail. There can be people by your side, whether that, like, do you see that as being impossible for a director to fill? Does that have to be an officer? One of the phrases you thought was that you felt like, I'm definitely butchering this, but some sort of divide between officers and board. And I just wonder, because I think one of the purposes of when we went through that restructure was to try and bring officers and board closer together. So it's not like you're all part of the same group, I guess. Because I'm just coming from a place where I think some directors are underutilized and officers aren't supported enough. So like a part of that does definitely come from being able to draw upon staff supports and for like partners.
Can I respond first? Okay. I would say it's not that I find it to be impossible for directors to fill that gap. I just think the gaps that I'm facing, I feel are sometimes different than the gaps that I believe are best filled by directors. The way, I'll try to elaborate, but I guess you could say, I feel like my portfolio is something that, like as a student who came into my position, who was very unfamiliar with the way that the provincial and federal government worked in like the municipality, I felt like that took me an entire 6 months to really understand. And I feel like when we think of directors, we also think of student leaders on our campus, representing our students' voices on the university level. And like, I know our directors can move way beyond the university level, can go municipal, federal, provincial as well. But it's hard to like put into words, but when I think of where directors could be the most support, I think of Rory's role. I don't necessarily think of my role, because Rory does so much internally at the university level where students provide direct feedback to directors as student leaders. Not saying that can't occur on the provincial and federal level, but it's kind of like throughout my year of being vice president, the person I've interacted with most is probably you, Jeff. I'm not saying that's a bad thing, but it's just kind of like, could I ask you suddenly to go talk to a federal like MP for me? Could I ask you to come to Ottawa with me? We've had multiple discussions, as well as like how much time and effort directors have to go through with co-op, with university level commitments as directors, as students as well. And like, I feel like asking you guys to suddenly work 15 hours, more than 15 hours, more than your honoraria, and I think the honoraria complicates it too, is it's not that it's asking too much, but it goes back to my same conversation of like, I could ask the part-time staff to do this suddenly, and I would still face like similar challenges where it's like, I'm suddenly asking you to do work, but I want you to like really understand the depth of why we're doing the work and like what it will take and how many hours. And that might be asking you to do 20 hours on top of your studies, on top of like a part-time job, on top of numerous other things. And I know that's different for every person. That's why I don't think it's impossible for a director to do, but it's kind of like, is it fair for me to come to like a director and say, on top of the 10 to 15 hours you're already doing with board studies, co-op, I need you to suddenly work, come with me to Ottawa, come with me to Toronto, like in the middle of the school year to like help me with this. I think travel plays a really big aspect into my portfolio too. And that's why I think in my mind, it seems more like staff work. I know I didn't really present that as clearly as I could have, but that's like my feelings about my role.
Not to jump in.
Yeah.
But then, if it is staff work, I guess, or have you been asking staff to do this same travel circuit in terms of going to Ottawa or going to Toronto? If your concern is that, you know, these directors aren't going to be able to drop everything and travel, if we make them part-time staff, I feel like the argument will be the same in terms of these will be students most likely, and they won't be able to drop everything and travel as well.
I would say travel is just a component about it. It's also what we discussed earlier is like, who are they reporting to? It's kind of like if I depend on different people on board, I'm having board take up multiple things at once, and that requires constant communication between many members of board and myself. And if I do choose to choose someone from board, not that it has anything necessarily to do with travel, but travel is heavily required in my portfolio. And it's kind of like, it's hard for me to travel alone. You won't always be there. Who else can I depend on? Like, could I ask a director suddenly? Would that be fair? Because we've also, not to pull out an example, but it's like the WUSA General Assembly at McMaster. I had to rely on like you, them, as well as Catherine, a part-time staff and a director, without asking ahead of time to suddenly Uber people around. I had to trust the information of like my corporate card with you guys, which is not appropriate, to ensure that people were like getting to the hotel safely. If Rory's not there to do that, because like you're somewhere else or like you're busy, you're double booked, like who else can I depend on? And it's not to say I can't depend on directors. It's like, it's a question of, is it fair? And like, is that the right support system? Because like directors won't always be there. If you weren't there or Catherine wasn't there, this would be a completely different experience at McMaster. And that's just like, it's a random, very like context-based example. This isn't like a universal example kind of thing.
Oh, yeah, sorry.
What would be the problem? Because you want someone from the very beginning to the very end. So directors are there from the very beginning to the very end. And if you have someone who's already designated, wouldn't they be able to fill in that gap? Because if you, or I guess the next VP chooses someone from the start, then they can also do some of that training and transition that the VP has to do anyway. And that way, they already know that they're going to be called for this. And I think speaking as a director, I came into this role expecting to do a lot more work than I think I ended up doing. I'm on like 7 different committees, and I think I've hit 5 hours of only filming once. And it goes back to what Jeff was saying about directors being underutilized. And also a gap on the director end is that we are very disconnected from advocacy. I think the average director, like, what's going on with advocacy? And I think if you integrate board into that advocacy work, then it goes back to the original goal of putting less of a gap between executives and directors, giving directors more work to do. And if you set that expectation at the very beginning, then you alleviate your concern of, I can't just suddenly call on someone to spend 20 hours a week because they're saying, I want to do this and I signed up to do this. And now you are not, if the work still stays with the board, it educates the board more on what's going on. And as a board, we are the elected student representatives. So wouldn't it make sense for us as board members to be the ones to be forming these connections and speaking on behalf of students?
I mean, we can, I guess if I were to respond to that, it's not, I guess you could say, at least from my perspective, it's just the way I see work being divided and how efficient that is, and if that's the right system that we should be taking. In my perspective, if we rely more on the board, that is, and this is just my perspective from the way that like we operate within the organization as officers and like do our work, that requires me to treat you all as staff members, and that requires, if I were still in this position for next year, it would require me to treat you all as staff members. And I feel like that would be a more, not to say burdensome is the right word, but I feel like that would require just as much effort and time to do that with a whole board rather than an individual person. And I know, like I was saying at the beginning, it depends what the next board wants, because as board members, we also have the power to appoint a director to take on different duties and responsibilities, but that also requires understanding of what you're doing next year. So.
I forgot the first thing, but the second point that came up. Oh, sorry. My first question was, why a part-time staff member, that part-time officer then with 20 hours? Because if you're expecting someone to be able to, what it really sounds like is you want someone you can like kind of go to as like a reliable partner or second for certain issues to fill in gaps and be with support the VP through everything, right? So why a part-time officer? Because from what you say, sometimes you might need them to drop everything and go to annual one. Like Rory said, there's no difference between a director who's supposed to be doing 10 hours and a student who's going to be on co-op and on school if they're only doing 20 hours. And then I have a second, but ultimately.
If I were to respond to that quickly, I'm just looking at other models at other institutions that have been very successful. For instance, at McMaster and Western, they separate the board's duties, the council's duties, as well as their executive team's duties. And at every other student union, there's at least, I'm going to say 2 or 3 VPs who help balance this workload and the president. And I feel like I guess you could say I'm branching from successful models and seeing if that can apply here and recognizing that might take us back to the similar governance structure.
My second question was in discussions with some people who were more familiar with the old governance model and had come to peace with it. Something one person used to say to me was they saw the board as potentially being, 13. One that they could like to help spread the workload. But execs, you mentioned that the board can. Whenever you talk about the issues with interacting with the board, you always say the board as a whole. Why not look at individual directors and say, if it is an officer position that we want them to promote individual assigned, like the board appoints individual directors to be officers that support the VP directly. Would that do what?
No.
You don't need to do that. You're onto something though, if I could jump in. There's nothing preventing the board from saying, Jeff, as a director, this is what we need you to focus on this year. And you still are a director of the board carrying that accountability. That's what comes through. You don't need another title. I think we've come up with a few things within your bylaws that need some streamlining, and it's the use of the term officer that really needs some streamlining too. But I think what Katie, you're saying you need the consistency right from the beginning of somebody who, if it's, and just because you two are right here, if it's, these two are going to be the directors who will work alongside you in the VP role, you can call them all to say, I need you to go to Ottawa today, I need you to go to Toronto, hopefully it won't be today, but you know, you plan a little bit, but I think that's what you're trying to get at, that there needs to be a consistent pool that you can call on, and there is no reason why the directors couldn't do that if they know upfront.
I think the reason for the other title might be that might lead to an increase in the responsibilities and duties beyond that from other directors requiring perhaps, I think our policy manual is set up to allow for different like stipend levels, like
Yeah.
Katie says, like, is that fair? If people go into the expectation of like, you're now supporting the vice president on municipal affairs or federal affairs or something, do you think that could be pushed for, or does that still have some gaps where I think there are risks that
I think it'd probably be up for like the,
we can, yeah.
oh yeah, aside. I do have to go in 6 minutes. That's a heads up.
Okay.
But it's just about supports.
Do you have a point of order, Alex?
We're all thinking it clusters. Is this not a description of, I know.
Clusters would be affected. Clusters focus on specific themes. We're talking about entire portfolio.
Okay, can I present the governance side? So when we were doing this model, this was never established formally, but we thought of a point system. So like each batch of responsibilities that a director has is like 10. If you are the chair of a committee, let's say that takes up like 5 points of your time, because committee chairs, depending on the busyness of the committee, that might be a lot of work for you every couple of weeks. I would say if you do give this responsibility to directors, it might just be that you would make sure that it is directors who don't have a huge batch of other responsibilities. So not that every director is a fiduciary as a base level, but the Lego blocks that we put on top of them afterwards can be different. Like Alex cares a lot about, Jeff is my better example. Jeff cares a lot about municipal advocacy, housing, also co-op. Tam's a bit about co-op. So like Tam is not necessarily going to spend that much time on a federal issue, trains. But just because like we have those different batches. Anyway, I'll end my point here, but we can sort of work it out if it were to be directors. End of point.
Your hand up.
I'll start forget at this point, but I don't know what Mike said.
Okay.
Okay, wait, 2 things. One, like conversations are coming up, directors underutilized, we need more support. You want part-time officers. Directors becoming part-time officers is one thing that could happen, which is what you're asking for. That's what, maybe they're not actually part-time officers. Well, like effectively fulfilling that gap as it was. You said clusters are not what we're looking for, but because they focus on specific issues, well, we're looking for a portfolio. Like one cluster was municipal affairs. Is that not a portfolio?
I think quick
Like
response.
if that director was then, or directors by cluster, like they'd be.
Going back to like what I said at the very beginning, I think it's not, I know I attached those job descriptions, but I mainly did it as an example because in my mind, the best support for my VP role is someone who can do provincial, federal, and municipal.
Okay.
And I feel like if we break it up, then that's more work again, because now I have to coordinate with 3 people. And from my discussions about what these roles used to used to look like as well. There was a concern about the VP managing multiple people as well and how complicated it can be. Not saying like a director can't be appointed, like that can also work. But I think it just ties in to like the complexity of like what's the best way of doing it and what's something that we would like to do.
Okay, so not to too much promises like that thing. So you want whatever support you want to mirror the responsibilities of VP.
I don't think it's mirroring.
Because you just said you sort of want them to be able to cover all the bases. So how's that?
I don't know how.
You
Do you want me to try?
Yes.
Yeah. So, and I'm gonna be blank with it. There are a whole bunch of responsibilities that you have. You have a passion about housing, for example. So that's where you want to put all of your eggs. But everything, you still need to do municipal, federal, provincial affairs. Jeff, you're really good at that. So that's what you would support.
That's not what I'm hearing.
That's what I was hearing, because you need somebody,
No,
because she's
but-
gonna, time wise,
Is that what you were saying?
maybe I.
I heard a lot more of what Jeff was
Oh,
saying.
yeah, sorry.
I'm not saying, I guess you could say, from my perspective, I don't think dividing up my portfolio among directors is effective. And I'm not saying like, back to the same topic, I'm not saying a director couldn't take up that work, but it's kind of like mirroring my responsibilities isn't necessarily something that I want. I want someone who I can communicate with as another. If I were to envision the role that would support me if I was still in this position for the next year, I would want someone who I could have in my office with me. We develop a plan for the entire year about what we're going to do provincial, federally, and municipally, outside of, according to the long range plan, according to the annual plan, that focuses on key aspects of advocacy. And I feel like the reason we've tried clusters and we've tried assigning directors to different aspects. Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. Are we
I
good?
think it's a very complex thing, but it all depends on the next VP conclusion.
Okay.
And now I
sounds
must
good.
go.
No, you're staying here.
I have to go.
You have to stay. You can't leave with police forum. You might stay for 3 minutes. So moving on to the next item. So 2.1, I'm gonna amend it so that it says, be it resolved that Arya Rasmussen be appointed to a director position starting May 1st, 2024 to April 30th, 2025. Be it further resolved that Arya Rasmussen be appointed to a new officer role, which shall have the duties and responsibilities as assigned by the board. Okay, I will move that. Can I have someone second that? Alex? That amendment, I'm going to take on friendliness, I heard the term. But yeah, so any quick discussion? I think we can all agree that the process of how this was gone about was not the best, and I apologize. Yeah, hopefully next term something can, or next time that this happens, something better can occur. Go ahead, Jay, if you had something to say.
Yeah, I do have some to say. Just quite quick question. What about the voting rights for this ex-officer? Does he will he have like all the voting rights as a VP or no? And what about the voting rights in the committees he's gonna sit?
As a director, they would have all the same voting rights as any other director. In terms of duties, I think the expectation would be that a lot of their duties would be very similar to the vice presidency role, but obviously we cannot call them that specifically, just based on our bylaws. That is my understanding. Okay. Sounds good. Okay, I'm gonna get right to the voting then. Given the time constraints, all those in favor, please raise your hand. And any opposed? Is that a legacy hand or is that an opposed, Jay?
That's in favor.
Okay, so that's everything. Yeah, I don't think we have any reports. You're free to go now, Katie, if you're wanting to.
Hi, Katie.
Fine, okay.
Apologies for keeping you 2 minutes
I have an appointment, so that's why I have to go.
for the doctors, don't mind.
Meet and greet.
So I will call, anyway, the general absence first. Last board meeting's coming up on the 24th, similar time to regular 6:30. It should just be last sort of updates and things like that, as well as some few important items coming. It might be a slightly longer meeting than usual, so be prepared for that. There is an upcoming, another event the day before on the 23rd, which is for both the incoming and outcoming board from 2:30 to 5. That was shared with all of you just, I think, earlier today, I believe. So please mark off your calendar for that. Besides that, I wish you all luck with your exams, and I hope that you do good on those. Bye, Katie, and I will call this meeting to adjournment at 2:54 p.m.
Suzanne, are we ready till 5 p.m. for meet and greet, or is there any way I could sneak out eventually?
Rory's not here, so he's probably.
So what?
I just said Rory's not here to stop you.
Oh,
Probably
okay.
fine, I'm just joking. I'm asking
In
you some
theory.
only some questions.
Like if I sneak out at 4:30,
That's gonna have to be your call,
the
right?
giant essay
Then you-
is coming at Thursday.
You might know some of these pieces, so that's, up to yeah, just go those things.
We're ending with operational updates,
Okay.
which you probably know some of, so that would be good. I was gonna pass this around just
am I
because
doing?
I'd like to proactively order something. So if you can just tick what you think your shirt size would be.
I mean, in a perfect world, it would be large, but.
Oh, do you want the
College
do you want
weights
the
are.
measurements? If the measurement shirt you sent me?
It is, I'm not gonna, wasn't gonna, you can, if he wants to look at it. I'll
You're
have,
pretty.
Good.
I'll have other stuff. And then one of the things at the end is that we want to do headshots and some new stuff. So this
Nice.
is